Today, Sunday, 4th August, the situation in the Middle East continues to remain exceptionally tense. There's still no sign of an Iranian attack on Israel, though most assume that such an attack is coming. In fact, the Iranians have all but promised it. But as we will see, there are lots of signs that a war in the Middle East is almost upon us and that it will come fairly soon. The very latest theory, by the way, one that's been promoted in parts of the media, is that the Iranian attack will be timed for Monday, the 12th of August. Now that, as it happens, is a Jewish holiday, or at least an important Jewish day of commemoration. I'm not sure whether it is a holiday. It is the 9th, it is Tisha B'Av, the day of disasters, an annual fast day in Judaism in which a number of disasters in Jewish history, occurred, primarily the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonian Empire, of King Nebuchadnezzar, and of the Second Temple by the Romans in 79 AD. Well, that may be true. We'll see. I'm not sure whether the Iranians follow the Jewish calendar, but we'll just have to wait and see what they do. But anyway, that theory is circulating, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Now, before I discuss the very latest moves, there are a number of important points I want to make about matters that I touched on in my last video. Now, the first thing I wanted to say is that I have had information from the most authoritative possible source, someone who previously had an important position in the United States government and who has conclusively confirmed that Fuad Shukr was not the person that organized the bomb attack, the suicide bomb attack on the US Marines in 1983. Every single media commentary that I've seen about Fuad Shukr over the last couple of days has been referring to him as the person who was in some way involved in that particular attack on the US Marines in 1983. This individual, who, as I said, I regard as completely authoritative on this question, somebody who absolutely knows, has confirmed that this is absolutely not the case. He has informed me that the actual person who carried out the attack was an individual known as Mugnier, that in the 1980s, he was somebody that the United States and Western countries took as considerable interest in. This is Mugnier as a terrorist mastermind of some kind, and that Imad Mugnier, to give him his name, was not only involved in organizing this attack on the Marines, but he was also involved in attacking other US and military and diplomatic targets, and that he played a central role in organizing the kidnappings of people like Bill Buckley, who was CIA Chief of Station, Colonel Bill Higgins of the US Marine Corps, the Reverend Terry Waite, who was the representative of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the journalist Terry Anderson. So he was somebody who was heavily searched, looked for by the United States. I've no doubt that corroboration of what this source has told me can be found in open sources as well, though I don't have the time to look for them. But the fact is that it was Imad Mugnier, not Fuad Shukr, who was the person who was behind the attack on the US Marines in 1983. So all of the reports that you have seen to this effect, the fact, that he was the mastermind behind that attack, are wrong. I did point out, admittedly, in my previous video, that if he was still around and still a commander in Hezbollah today, given that this attack, well, took place decades ago, he would by now be a rather elderly gentleman. But in fact, it turns out that Fuad Shukr was not the mastermind that we have been told that he was. Anyway, that's the first thing I wanted to say. I ought to quickly add that the only reason I have not identified the person who's provided me with this information is because I was given it in a private email, but it is possible that the person's identity will be disclosed at some point. Anyway, that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing that I wanted to say is that I'm now having increasing doubts, my skepticism about the narrative that Ismail Haniyeh was killed by a bomb inserted in the building, the guest house in which he was located in Tehran. I'm now, I'm afraid, starting to have serious doubts about that whole story. And I perhaps ought to explain that it's not the story itself, the idea that the Israeli intelligence might not have been able to plant a bomb in a guest house, that makes me increasingly unsure. Rather, it is the fact that the story is starting to be contradicted, and in addition, that the places where we're getting this information from, the Daily Telegraph and the New York Times, I'm starting to have serious doubts about the reliability of the information that they are conveying. Now, I discussed yesterday at length the long account of the bombing theory that was provided to the Daily Telegraph. I mentioned that it's made absolutely no sense to me that this kind of information would have been provided to the Daily Telegraph by members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as was being alleged, that it made no sense to me either that an aide of the new Iranian president would also be speaking about these matters to the Daily Telegraph. And that did make me wonder about the whole story. But the thing that has added further doubts to it is that over the course of yesterday, an article appeared in the Financial Times, which briefly propounded a completely different theory, one that which gives a completely different explanation for how the assassination took place. And it appeared, as I said, in the Financial Times, but this time it does actually unequivocally originate from Iran. And the title of the article reads, "Iran blames Israel for short-range strike that killed Hamas leader." And the article, which is sourced from a journalist called Bita Ghaffari, who we're told is in Iran, in Tehran, in fact. Anyway, the article then goes on to say, Iran said Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed by a short-range projectile that was fired into the official residence where he was staying in Tehran. And the country's Revolutionary Guards said on Saturday that the assassination was orchestrated and executed by Israel, and that the United States was complicit in the attack. And we are then told that this was a deeply humiliating attack on Iran. And we then read that the guards, the Revolutionary Guards, said that the investigation into Haniyeh's assassination revealed that a short-range projectile with a warhead weighing about 7 kilos, that's a fairly large explosive warhead, was used. The attack, the projectile caused a powerful explosion from outside the area where the guest's residence was located. I don't pretend that I completely understand that. And then there's comments in the article about how the Iranians intend to avenge themselves for this attack. And we read that Haniya's assassination on home territory is considered a security breach for Iran and has revived fears about enemy agents penetrating the country's intelligence apparatus. Hussein Ali Haji Deligani, an Iranian lawmaker, said the possibility of hired agents having played a role in Haniya's assassination cannot be ruled out. Notice that these are public comments. And another public comment is that comes from another Iranian official, Ismail Qasari, a member of the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, insisted Tehran would respond forcefully. Exacting revenge is a question of defending our honor and territory. Avenging Haniya's blood will entail a heavier response. And of course, he obviously means a heavier response than the one that Iran engaged in back in April. So, a completely different account of the attack in the Financial Times from the one that we were provided in the Daily Telegraph and the New York Times. Some kind of a projectile allegedly was fired at the building with a relatively large explosive warhead. The warhead exploded just outside the apartment building, the apartment where Haniya was located, and the effect, however, was to cause his death. Now, I'm not an expert in these matters. I wonder whether this is a drone attack. What has been discussed here is either a drone attack or conceivably an attack on this building by agents operating inside Iran who launched some kind of anti-tank missile at the building. The comments that we got from Hossein Ali Haji Deligani about hired agents having played a role in Haniya's assassination and about a security breach, having revived fears about enemy agents having penetrated the country's intelligence apparatus, might suggest that it was in fact agents from outside launching a missile at the building rather than a drone. But I'm not going to get drawn into the technical matters, which I'm not remotely in a position to judge or discuss, and where I would almost certainly, if I plunged in too far, start making increasingly egregious errors. The key and most interesting fact about this Financial Times article is that it makes no reference at all to the bomb theory. If there were two theories circulating which carried equal weight, then I would assume that the Financial Times, which published this story some hours after the reports in the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph appeared, I would assume that the Financial Times would refer to the previous articles in the New York Times and in the Daily Telegraph, or to the news reports about the bomb, if only to say that there are two different accounts about how the assassination was conducted. It almost seems to me that this article, which has appeared some hours ago in the Financial Times, describing the assassination in this way, with the foreign projectile launched at the building, is intended by someone in the, world of publishing and media and intelligence, in effect, to correct or to refute the earlier story about the bomb, without, of course, mentioning it or criticizing the media outlets that have been circulating it. At least that's my own impression. Anyway, that's one thing. So I explained yesterday why the story in the Daily Telegraph, with all of the leaks of information to the Daily Telegraph itself, seemed to me dubious. But now we've had this article in the Financial Times, which not only gives a completely different account, but does so in a way that seems to be intended to challenge and perhaps even refute the other account, the earlier account of the bomb. So just saying. So there is another thing that I've seen, which has also been passed on to me by a source, a very authoritative source, extremely authoritative source, which is that this particular source rather thinks that the Iranians are probably right and that the United States at some level was aware and was in some way involved or at least implicated in the assassination of Haniyeh. And the point that this person, again, I'm not going to identify this person, has pointed out is the presence of the WASP amphibious warfare force, presumably in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm not exactly sure where it is located. It would have taken some time to deploy this powerful warship with its marine contingent and its accompanying supporting warships to the area. And the fact that this force was set in motion and deployed where it was may suggest that the United States was forewarned of what was happening. Now, I'm going to make two quick observations about this. It may be that the United States was given prior warning by Israel that an assassination attempt was going to happen. But I wonder whether the warning only extended to the assassination attempt on Fuad Shukr, who was, of course, a Hezbollah official. As I understand it, the WASP is principally deployed. If this is correct, I'm not sure. If it is deployed, as I believe, in the Eastern Mediterranean, then that might point to concern about Lebanon, about Hezbollah's reaction, and that might indeed suggest that the United States had some forewarning of the attack, the assassination of Fuad Shukr himself. I ought to say that for several weeks now, there's been a drumbeat of warnings that Israel is preparing some kind of attack on Hezbollah. And as I remember, some weeks ago, the US made clear that if there was an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah, the United States would assist Israel in it, that the United States would act to support Israel in that war. So it could be that, as I say, it's the Fuad Shukr assassination that lies behind this deployment, and the expectations of a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, rather than the assassination of Haniyeh himself, the Haniyeh in Tehran. And maybe that was a surprise for the United States. Having said that, there are a number of things that I must say. Firstly, of course, I'm not exactly sure where the WASP is located. If it is located closer to the Persian Gulf, for example, then of course the calculus might be different. And in that case, it would be close to Iran, and it might indeed in that case have been the Haniyeh assassination that provoked this deployment. That is one. The second is that we have had a long history of misdirection, and the level of misdirection that is taking place at the moment about the situation in the Middle East is quite simply off the scale. I've seen huge amount of this in recent years. We all know about it. But I don't think I've ever seen anything quite on the scale that we are seeing now. I mean, we've had this bizarre story about the bomb or the missile strike that killed Hania, two completely contradictory accounts of the assassination, each attributed to the Iranians, each apparently supported by different groups of people within the West. We have had the misdirection about Fuad Shukr's role in the bomb attack on the US Marines in 1983. And, well, we've had a long pattern of the US administration saying one thing and doing another. In fact, as I have pointed out many times, there was actually a virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden, I think it was now over a year ago, in which the Chinese readout shows that President Xi Jinping actually complained directly to President Biden that President Biden regularly gives all kinds of assurances, specifically on the subject of Taiwan, but that the subsequent actions of the US government, of the very administration which President Biden heads, contradict those assurances. So, given this disinformation that we're seeing at the moment, misdirection that we're seeing at the moment, given this past history, I suppose it is not impossible that the United States was pre-warned about the assassination of Hania, and that all the things that we were reading yesterday in Axios about how President Biden was shocked by the fact that Hania had been assassinated is untrue. If that is correct, and by the way, I still struggle at some level to believe it. I still find an act of bad faith such as that would be, almost unimaginable. But if that is really true, then all I can say is that the United States has been playing an extremely complicated double game with all kinds of people for a very, very long time. They've been telling everybody that they support negotiations and a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. They've been supporting negotiations between Hamas and Israel to seek a ceasefire in Qatar, and at the same time as they're doing all of that, they've been giving the green light to Israel to assassinate Hamas's lead negotiator. And after the assassination, they've come along and pretended that they were not informed of it and somehow disapproved of it. So I'm not saying that this is inconceivable. On the contrary, as I said, we've seen the administration do similar things before, but the lengths to which this would have been done, the way in which friendly Arab governments, including Qatar, would have been deceived, it would be astonishing, and it would take one's breath away. And of course, if it were ever confirmed, the damage it would do to US credibility in the Middle East, such as it is, would be simply off the scale. Anyway, there we are. I wanted to discuss all of those things. Let me now turn to the actual situation in the Middle East. We're continuing to get reports of more and more US military deployments. We're told that F-22 Raptor fighter jets, these are fifth generation fighter jets, are being deployed by the United States to the Middle East. We're being told that the United States is moving THAAD anti-ballistic missiles to the Middle East as well. I didn't know these missiles could be moved so fast, but apparently they are. We are also being told that actions are being taken now to evacuate US and Western citizens from Lebanon. That the embassies, all of the Western embassies in Lebanon, the Western embassies in Beirut, the US embassy, the British embassy, apparently other embassies as well, are urgently advising their citizens, Western citizens, to leave Beirut. It must be assumed that Western governments are now being provided by Israel with specific and clear warnings about what Israel intends to do in Lebanon. And this is causing not only great alarm, but is also causing the governments, the Western governments, the governments that are receiving these warnings, to take this information so seriously that they're now rushing to evacuate all of their citizens. And apparently there are no exceptions. And there's even a report which I saw that Western governments are advising their citizens that if they choose to disregard these warnings and to stay in Lebanon, then they are on their own, and Western governments might not be in a position to provide them with any future support and assistance. Now, all this is dramatic enough, but I have to say that I received another email yesterday. This is not from somebody who's had any role that I'm aware of in the US government, but one of the most astute commentators that I know, not just about affairs in the Middle East, but generally. And this person, again, I'm not going to disclose who it is because this was a private email, has speculated to me that the Israelis might be contemplating doing something in Lebanon on a scale that has never been done before, using weapons which, well, haven't been used, certainly not by Israel before. Now, I don't want to say any more about that because this is a speculation, it is a theory, but the very fact that these theories are being floated, and I want to stress this commentator is one of the most level-headed people I know of, certainly not someone to jump to conclusions. And, well, the urgency of these warnings sort of support this theory. Well, if this is really the case, the very fact that there's theories like this are floating around is telling us how incredibly dangerous this whole situation has now become. Anyway, there are now all kinds of moves also being made by the other side, and it turns out we're getting a lot of information about action that the Russians have been taking over the last couple of hours, or rather days. And apparently there have been multiple flights by Russian Ilyushin 96 and Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft to Iran. And it's been suggested that the Russians are now busy supplying Iran with extremely powerful Murmansk electronic warfare systems. And I've seen photos. There's a photograph on Simplicius the Thinker's Substack channel of what this or what I presume is this system. It shows a number of level or long, high masts. I'm not going to pretend that I understand the nature of the system, but there's also a report that a quote from some source that Simplicius the thinker is quoting. It might be the Jerusalem Post. I'm not exactly sure about this, but maybe this is wrong. But anyway, the report says Iran has apparently received Russian ultra-long-range electronic warfare systems Murmansk BN. Previously, these complexes were deployed in the Northern Fleet and in Crimea. The 475th Electronic Warfare Center was responsible for its use there. I doubt that the Russians will have taken any long-range electronic warfare systems from Crimea, certainly not at this time. And the distinctive feature is a suppressive range of up to 5,000 kilometers, which seems astonishing. The Murmansk BN complex is located on 7 trucks. Its antennas are mounted on 4 telescopic supports up to 32 meters high. Well, 5,000 kilometers is a huge distance. And, well, one wonders exactly what this system is precisely intended to do. But I doubt that the Murmansk BN has required multiple flights of Ilyushin 96 and Ilyushin 76 aircraft to Iran. I wonder what else the Russians have been supplying to Iran as well. And then there is another very interesting article which appeared in CNN Politics, of all places. Again, I'm getting this from Simplicius the thinker. He's been very much on top of following all of these articles. But anyway, CNN Politics says that the Russians pulled back weapons shipments to the Houthis amid US and Saudi pressure. And we're told that Russia was preparing to deliver missiles, another military equipment to the Houthi rebels in Yemen last month, but pulled back at the last minute amid a flurry of behind-the-scenes efforts by the United States and Saudi Arabia to stop it. And then there's a further article that Russian GRU intelligence officers have been behind the string of successful Houthi hits on Red Sea vessels, and that US intelligence suggests Russian military is advising the Houthis inside Yemen. Now, we need to be very careful about this because, of course, we have so many articles around the world that blame the Russians for everything that goes wrong. There are articles today, there's an article today, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which is blaming the Russians for the ongoing riots that are happening this summer in some British cities. Supposedly, it's all been coordinated by some Russian website I've never heard of. Just saying. But anyway, we get a lot of attempts to blame the Russians for this and that. But there is one reason why this story about the Russians, well, maybe they are or maybe they're not involved in providing intelligence to the Houthis to help the Houthis carry out their strikes, their missile strikes. But maybe there is more substance to the story that the Russians were on the brink of supplying missiles, long-range missiles, and presumably that is the major concern to the Houthis. And that is, of course, that is exactly what the Russians threatened they would do some months ago. This was at the time when there were all sorts of ideas floating around about the United States and the Western powers authorizing Ukraine, allowing Ukraine to use missiles, ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, to launch strikes deep inside Russia. Now, the Russians at the time gave multiple warnings that if anything like that happened, Russia would respond, perhaps directly itself. The Russians called in the British ambassador to the foreign ministry in Moscow and told the British ambassador that if British missiles were used in attacks on Russia, given that those missiles could only be used with the assistance of British technicians, the Russians would assume direct British involvement in that attack, and that Russia would in that case reserve the right to launch strikes against British military facilities anywhere in the world, including by implication against Britain itself. But then there was the further discussion about the United States specifically allowing missile strikes with ATACMS missiles deep inside Russia. And then the Russians, as I said, gave the warning that if that happened, they might start supplying similar missiles or even more powerful missiles to US adversaries. And I remember discussing at the time that one of the adversaries that the Russians would obviously have in mind were the Houthis in Yemen. So it seems from this CNN story that is exactly what the Russians were going to do, that they were actually going to follow up with this threat, and that they probably communicated to the Americans and perhaps to the Saudis. Perhaps they communicated this information to the Americans through the Saudis, that the Russians were going to provide these weapons to the Houthis. And then the Americans apparently, and this is the gist of the CNN article, then cut a deal with the Russians, whereby the Russians agreed not to provide the Houthis with these long-range and these powerful new weapons. And I can't help but think that in return, the United States gave the Russians assurances that Ukraine would not be able to use long-range missiles, ATACMS and Storm Shadows and others to launch attacks inside Russia. So that looks like the deal that was done there. But anyway, put all that aside, we see that the Russians, all the indications are that the Russians are indeed very active, that they're very, very busy in the Middle East. And finally, to round everything up, there's been warnings this time, including apparently from Axios, that this time, if there were a Iranian missile strike on Israel, it would be very hard for the United States and Israel to replicate the interception success that they achieved against the initial Iranian missile strike that took place in April, the one that happened following the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy or consular building in Damascus. And there is a quote, a direct quote to Axios from a US official: "We think it will be very hard to replicate the huge success we had with defeating the attack if Iran launches hundreds of missiles and drones again, and the Israelis know it." And, well, it could be, it's been suggested, that in fact the problem is that Israel used so many of its air defense missiles to defeat the April attack that it's short of missiles, and by implication, so is the United States. But of course, beyond that, it's likely also that the Iranians this time will probably give less, well, probably won't give any warning, and that this time the missiles that they will launch will be their more powerful ones, the ballistic missiles with the more precise targeting and the maneuverable high speed, perhaps hypersonic warheads. So, altogether, a very dramatic and rather alarming situation. People being evacuated from Lebanon. It looks as if some major event is being prepared in Lebanon. Fears in the United States that the next time the Iranians strike, not only will the strike be much harder, but that it will be all but impossible to replicate the success that was achieved in April, that far more damage this time will be done. I suspect that behind that there is the further looming fear that if the Iranians launch one strike, it could be followed by further ones, that Iran and Hezbollah have a massive stockpile of missiles that they could keep on launching towards Israel. The stockpiles of air defense missiles are already massively overstretched. We've seen the problem in Ukraine. The United States and Israel, even if they are initially successful in shooting down Iranian missiles, and it's increasingly likely that more and more of them will get through, eventually their ability to shoot down missiles will start to wane as their stockpile of air defense missiles becomes depleted. And at that point, well, the real problems presumably will begin. In other words, the United States and Israel simply cannot afford a protracted war against Iran in the Middle East, and that is what they fear they might be about to be drawn into. And, well, that, by the way, fears about that might give further support to those worries about what the Israelis might be planning in Lebanon. The incredible escalation, if it really happens, that the Israelis might be contemplating there. Though I still have to say, I find it really beyond my imagination to think that that kind of escalation is really on the way. So, an incredibly dangerous situation in the Middle East. We come back to the question that I asked yesterday, which is, how did we get here? Now, I say this, there's still a constant refusal by many people in the West to acknowledge this. For example, I read what I consider to be a truly astonishing article in, where else? The Daily Telegraph, which tells us that by Jake Wallace Simmons, which tells us that the West must be prepared to take the strongest possible action in the Middle East, because only by doing so can World War III be avoided. That up to now, the situation in the Middle East, the West has supposedly shown a pusillanimous response to the situation in the Middle East, but eventually, if this supposed policy of appeasement continues, then war in the Middle East will escalate. And, we're told, for example, that the West has somehow forgotten that if you shun conflict, it will come for you on the enemy's terms. And despite its overwhelming military might, the articulated West has lost any sense of moral health and martial vigor. It pays lip service to the Jewish state's right of self-defense, but when Israel retaliates, it is accused of warmongering. In the ears of many Israelis, calls for de-escalation sound like requests to bare their necks for the knife. Strength is the currency of the Middle East. 2 days after 12 Israeli children. Now notice again, I said earlier in the program about the immense amount of misdirection that is taking place. A more accurate way to describe them would be 12 Druze and Christian children in the occupied Golan Heights. Anyway, were killed playing football. The talismanic Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's military commander Mohammed Deif were all confirmed dead. And this is so far so good, but no one knows whether Iran's reprisal will herald World War III and all of that. So, we're told that this is all appeasement, that it's the Iranians who are acting aggressively. But again, where is the evidence of the Iranians acting aggressively? What proof do these people show that Iran is acting aggressively? Now, I've quoted this article not because, frankly, I pay very much attention to what this article by Jake Simon says, but because I was reading that the G7, yesterday that the G7, the group of seven, in other words, the leading Western countries, through Italy, are addressing another letter to Iran, asking Iran to show restraint in this situation. And the article that I've just read seems to be consistent with the mindset that has produced that letter, that it is Iran up to now that has been failing to show restraint, that it is Iran that has been driving this crisis. But where is the evidence of this? I know there is a school of thought which claims that Iran had some foreknowledge and some role in the attack by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October. But apparently Israeli and US intelligence have taken a different view. They both believe that Iran was not involved. There have been media articles in the United States and Israel which say as much. So Iran was not involved in that. There's been a massive Israeli response, fierce attack on Gaza. It's been underway for many, many months, but Iran has sought to respond diplomatically. There was an attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, but the Iranians were very careful to telegraph their counter-missile strike days in advance to the Americans, making it relatively easy for the United States and Israel and various other countries to shoot down the missiles that the Iranians were sending towards Israel. There was an Israeli counterstrike after that Iranian missile strike, about which we know very little, but the Iranians didn't respond to it. Surely, if the G7 wants to bring this situation in the Middle East under control, if they want to stabilize the situation in the Middle East, then letters via Italy ought not to be sent to Tehran. They ought to be sent to Jerusalem instead, to the Israeli leadership there. In fact, I would go much further than this. I think straightforward, open statements by the United States and the other Western countries, perhaps through the vehicle of the UN Security Council, telling Israel that the situation has now been reached where patience is exhausted and Israel must, from now on, act with restraint and begin serious negotiations to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, a ceasefire which, by the way, as a precondition, would involve the release of all of the Israeli hostages. Surely that is the way to bring the situation under control. And yet we still read articles in which it's the Iranians apparently who are acting aggressively. As I said, though I've seen no evidence of this, it is the Iranians who, when they respond, are actually seen instead as the initiators of whatever is happening. You know, the fact that somebody has been assassinated in their own capital is something which presumably the Iranians must disregard. When individuals are assassinated in Britain, allegedly by the Russians, evidence for the claim that it was the Russians is not always that clear. But anyway, when the Russians allegedly assassinate people in Britain, does anybody call on the British in that kind of situation to exercise restraint? Anyway, there we go. So this is why we are where we are. And the Israeli government understands this very well. Prime Minister Netanyahu understands this very well. It is he who is seeking, he and the other senior officials in the Israeli government, in the Israeli cabinet, it is they who are seeking escalation in the Middle East. It must be said there are articles in the media in the West that acknowledge as much, but Western governments overall continue to show an inability to acknowledge this fact. And I'm going to say something. Persuading Israel to exercise restraint, to use its power, which is very real, wisely, is in Israel's own advantage. The events of the last 10 months, if they have demonstrated anything, to my mind, it is that the policy of permanent confrontation, of refusing fundamental compromises with the Palestinians and indeed with the other key Arab states, refusing to wrestle with the admittedly intractable, but in my opinion, nonetheless, still solvable problems of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a route to nowhere. In fact, it's a route to permanent war and failure. Ever since I can remember, throughout my lifetime, I remember hearing Israeli officials saying that Israel will respond ferociously to any attacks on itself or to Israeli citizens. And Israel has always responded in exactly that kind of way. And on many occasions, of course, it has taken preemptive action. And, well, what has that all achieved? We are in this situation where we're now looking at an outright war in the Middle East, and Axios tells us that a US official has briefed them that it's going to be more difficult this time to repel the Iranians, that the Iranian missile strike is going to be more difficult to repel. And anyway, We're getting all kinds of warnings from all sorts of people that the situation for Israel is such that it cannot afford a prolonged war, and that the same, by the way, is also true of the West and of the United States. So, Israel, in my opinion, would be far better advised pursuing a completely different course, one it has always ultimately rejected. It has never, in my opinion, psychologically prepared itself for the kind of compromises which would be necessary to achieve peace. And that is why we are at this catastrophic situation which we now find ourselves in. And Western governments have never acted as a true friend would have done, having Israel's actual long-term interests in mind, which is advising Israel or working with Israel to achieve a long-term, sustainable and just peace in the Middle East, which was certainly achievable before. I still believe might still be achievable now, but which is continuing to recede into the distance and might at some point become unachievable entirely. Anyway, there we are. A very, very tense situation. A situation of extraordinary crisis. And, well, I'm not sure where we go from here. But at some point over the next couple of days, weeks perhaps, maybe it really will be on the 12th of August, the Iranian attack will come, and we will see what the West does and what the Israelis do. And, well, anybody who knows or has any dealings with Lebanon, and I should say I have many Lebanese friends. There's a large Lebanese community in London. One of my best friends in the United States is Lebanese, and I also have a Lebanese friend in Switzerland as well. So anybody who has feelings about Lebanon, which I most emphatically do, must, at this moment in time, be deeply worried for the future of that much afflicted and tormented country. Anyway, let's now move on and return to the situation in Ukraine. And I think before we look at the very latest developments, which I will cover again rather briefly, let me just say something else, which is, of course, that the very last thing that Ukraine wants at this time is a major conflict between the United States and the Western powers in the Middle East. Ukraine is short of every conceivable form of military equipment at the moment. The only armoured vehicle that it seems to have a certain supply of are Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. They've been turning up all over the front lines. So the United States must have supplied significant numbers of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles over the last year. I remember that at the time when the preparations were being made for Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, the United States, by my memory, supplied around 100 to 150 Bradleys, but they must have supplied significant numbers of them over and above that. Now, there are hundreds of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in stock in the American stockpiles, but supplies of Bradleys are not unlimited, and given the number of Bradleys that are now appearing in Ukraine, I can't help but wonder that even those stockpiles, these fairly large stockpiles, must now be feeling the effect of the constant supplies of Bradley vehicles to Ukraine. Over the period of one 24-hour period, just Dima at the military summary channel said that he'd counted, he believed, 5 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles being destroyed in various places in Ukraine. 5, which gives us some sense of the level of losses that are taking place in Ukraine, armoured vehicle losses that are taking place in Ukraine. Given that the Russians are advancing, any Bradley that gets knocked out is probably difficult for the Ukrainians to return to the rear and to repair. It's likely that most of them fall into Russian hands, given that the Russians are advancing. So Bradley stockpiles are probably starting to reduce visibly to some extent because of the weight of the war in Ukraine, the need to continue to keep Ukraine supplied. But in other respects, the United States, as we know, is under very considerable stress. Shells are in short supply. It's probably true that Israel can get by with a lot fewer shells than Ukraine needs, given the very different sort of war that Ukraine would be fighting. But one thing Israel is going to need is lots and lots of anti-aircraft missiles. Israel does make its own anti-aircraft missiles, but it's a small country. Its industrial base is limited. It probably can only make a certain number and probably depends on the United States for vital subcomponents. I've discussed the difficulties the United States has in producing Patriot air defense missiles. Brian Beletic has gone into much more detail than me about this at the new Atlas. It is air defense missiles that Israel might find that it has to burn up in very substantial quantities over the next few days or weeks or months, depending on how long this confrontation lasts. If Israel wants to use missiles to conduct counterstrikes, it might eventually have to turn to the United States for help in supplying long-range missiles, and that will probably diminish numbers of ATACMS missiles that can be supplied to Ukraine as well. The demands, Israel's demands for weapons and Ukraine's demands for weapons are not identical, but they do overlap. And the authorities in Kiev must be looking at the prospect of a renewed war in the Middle East with great concern, because I cannot see how, if it happens, how it would not in that case affect Ukraine's already critically difficult supply situation. But what has been happening on the battlefields in Ukraine over the last couple of hours? Well, the answer is that it's more of the same. Now, over the last few hours, we're getting lots of reports about a major battle taking place in the village of Konstantinovka, north of Vuhledar and south of Marinka. This apparently is the biggest battle that we've seen on this area of the battlefronts. The 79th Air Assault Brigade, the Ukrainian paratroopers who have been defending Konstantinovka, are providing what look to be increasingly anguished messages. There's pictures, I've seen film of Konstantinovka from the air, presumably taken by a drone. And you see it being peppered with explosions, probably more from artillery and multiple launch rocket systems than bombs, but who am I to say? And it does look as if Konstantinovka is now under extremely intense attack. There is pictures appearing of Russian armored vehicles, tanks and such machines operating in the immediate vicinity of the road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar, confirming that it has been cut. There are further reports of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian units, apparently small groups of Russian soldiers operating well to the west of the road, further confirming that the road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar has been cut and that the Russians are moving closer to the next supply road to the west. So a major operational crisis for Ukraine is developing in this area, and it looks to me as if the days of Vuhledar and of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass are numbered, and that the crisis that is developing in this area is perhaps in some ways the most urgent crisis that Ukraine faces of all. I understand that the Ukrainians have replaced the commander of their forces in the Vremivka salient area. The Russians have been pushing north from the two villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine that they have recaptured. And of course, all of this, it's now increasingly clear, plays together with the general fighting in this area, in and around the town of Vuhledar. Interestingly, by the way, the Ukrainians refer to this area, where all of this fighting is taking place, as the Kurakhovo direction, which perhaps highlights the importance of Kurakhovo as the main supply base for the Ukrainian forces in this area. And as we know, Russian troops are very close to Kurakhovo, battling through the village of Maximilianovka, just to the east of Kurakhovo. They've now captured the metropolitan area of Krasnogorovka, and it seems that they're advancing through the two western roads that project north from Krasnogorovka, and they're, in other words, getting very close to Kurakhovo and are likely to begin soon another attack on Kurakhovo from that direction. And of course, if this entire area collapses, if Vuhledar is captured, if the Ukrainian troops are encircled there, if all the main supply roads are cut, well, it will be a disaster for Ukraine, and the situation could turn very bad for Ukraine, not just in southern Donbass, but potentially right across the southern front lines as well, opening up possibilities of a Russian advance from the south towards the important town of Pavlograd to the north, a town that lies immediately to the west of the east of the Dnieper River, and bringing the Russian troops into positions where they can start to move towards the two big industrial cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro. Zaporozhye lies also, as I understand it, on the east, mainly on the east bank of the Dnieper. Dnipro lies mostly on the west bank. So a major crisis there. And in the Pokrovsk area, if we can call it that now, the Avdiivka, Ocheretino, Pokrovsk area, we've had fewer reports over the last couple of hours, which is not a sign that there's any kind of operational pause going on there. On the contrary, if the Russians really are deploying the 27th Division with its mechanized infantry regiments to this area, then it's likely that the fighting in this area is about to intensify, not reduce. But we've had fewer reports, but those we have had also appear to suggest that the Russians are now tightening the ring that they've established, the cauldron that they've established around Ukrainian troops who are defending the village of Zelanye and who are also located in the fields to the west of this village, with the Russians attacking the village of Zelanye from the west, from the railway station and the railway line that they've just captured, but also from the east and the north, with Russian troops pushing to tighten their grip around this area where the Ukrainian troops are supposed to be encircled, that the Russians are gradually tightening the ring as they push towards the Ukrainians from here, through principally from the village of Novoselivka, Persha. Anyway, very intense battle going on there. Even more dramatic news from the Toretsk area. There's more reports. Again, we've had the recurring pattern of the fighting in the Toretsk area. Very latest photographic reports show Russian troops having advanced far deeper and far further into Ukrainian lines than anybody had expected to find them. It seems that not only have the Russians fully occupied the village of Zalizny, but that they're in the process of attacking and perhaps capturing an energy plant which lies immediately west of Zalizny. If this energy factory, this energy plant, whatever it is captured, then it seems that if there is indeed a cauldron, if there are indeed any Ukrainian troops located between the two advancing pincers of the Russian army, the one that's been pushing through the villages of Pivniye and Druzhba to the north, and which has now captured Zalizny, and the other grouping that's advancing through New York, there are any Ukrainian troops still located in this area between these two pincers, south of Pioneer Avenue, then they are indeed well and truly trapped now. And one wonders whether they're going to lay down their arms and surrender. There are some suggestions that that's precisely what they might have to do. And in addition, these latest photographic images apparently show the Russians tightening their grip around one of these two coal mines that lie immediately to the south of Toretsk. It looks as if this coal mine is about to be encircled as well, and if so, it will likely fall under Russian control very quickly. And another major fortified position in the Toretsk area would have been lost to Ukraine, to the Ukrainians, at extraordinary speed. Then further reports further north, the Ukrainians have now finally admitted that the Russians are indeed west of the aqueduct inside the central area of Chasiv Yar. The fact that the Ukrainians are now acknowledging the fact that DS and other Ukrainian mapping projects are starting to show the presence of Russian paratroopers west of the canal, to my mind, it suggests that the situation for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar has deteriorated further over the last couple of hours. And there's been also reports that the Russians are pushing further north from the village of Razdolovka along the main road to Siversk. The road is a fully built up area leading from Razdolovka to Siversk. The Russians have apparently pushed up significant distance along this road. They're now finally coming close to Siversk itself. It looks as if the battle for Siversk the actual battle for Siversk is perhaps 2 or 3 weeks away, but we're getting closer to the point when it happens. I should say that the Russian troops that are fighting around Siversk are also paratroopers, like the troops who are fighting in Chasiv Yar. The troops that are fighting in Chasiv Yar are from the 98th Airborne Guards Division. The troops who are fighting in Siversk, the Russian troops, are from the 106th Airborne Guards Division. As I've discussed in several programs, paratroopers still account to an extraordinary degree for the spearhead force that the Russians have been using in these battles. And lastly, and briefly, Volchansk. Reports appeared yesterday. I haven't seen them myself, but apparently the Chechen General Abdi Alaudinov, has now come forward and said that the Russians are now in control of half of the citadel area in Volchansk, half of the area of the high-rise buildings. As I said, I can't absolutely confirm this claim, but it does seem as if that might be the position. So, it's more of the same, as I said, the Russians continuing to advance. And of course, if there is a war in the Middle East, an all-out war in the Middle East, and by the way, on that topic, there's been a rather worrying article in the Financial Times trying to outline possible ways in which an all-out war in the Middle East might develop. Anyway, if there is an all-out war in the Middle East, it will drive the war in Ukraine from the headlines, and it will compound Ukraine's problems to a degree that, well, I think will make the whole situation in Ukraine finally and completely untenable. Now, before I finish this program, I want to just say that there's been a good article by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times. It appeared on the 2nd of July. I hadn't seen it before, but briefly, Stephen Bryan says that, in his opinion, the war in Ukraine is not going to end through negotiation. It is going to end with the surrender of Ukraine. That the obstacles, psychological and political, to negotiations in Ukraine are so great that it is going to be impossible to find any kind of route towards a successful negotiated outcome. And I think Stephen Bryan is right. I ought to say Stephen Bryan has been one of the most consistently correct commentators about the conflict in Ukraine up to this point. And, well, I think he's right. If you want to read the analysis that Stephen Bryan has written, it is in Asia Times. The headline is Ukraine War Will End in Surrender. And, well, that's, I think, all I can say about it. Now, in various programs, I have been saying recently that I wanted to discuss a very alarming program that Glenn Deason and I recently did with Professor Theodore Postel. And I've always been aiming to discuss it in these programs. It was posted, by the way, a couple of hours ago on the Duran, so it's perhaps a good idea to watch this program first. I haven't, up to now, because of these events in the Middle East, been able to find the time to discuss it, but I do intend to discuss it properly in my program tomorrow. All I will say is that over the course of the various interviews that Glenn Deason and I have done, only two programs, only two interviews have profoundly shocked me to the absolute core. One was a program we did with Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was, of course, Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, and who described a situation within the US government that I found absolutely horrifying. And the other was this interview that Glenn Deason and I have just done with Theodore Postel, which again says things about the situation within the higher institutions of the US government and the scientific community generally, which, to be frank, appalled me. Suffice to say that after both interviews, the one with Wilkerson, and the one with Postel, I was so shocked that I had to, I developed a migraine after each. Anyway, I do intend to say more about it in the program tomorrow, but I would urge everybody, if they want to understand what I'm going to say about it tomorrow, to watch the program first. Anyway, this is where I finish today's programs. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, Rofkin, all of the others. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all the amazing things that we have there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.